Hello everyone, our research project wants to explore the experience and contribution of Chinese women immigrants in Australia. We chose the museum exhibition project. Our presentation will be divided into 4 parts. In the first part, we will introduce the overview of the topic. The second part will show our museum floor plan. In the third part, we will introduce the history of female immigrants from 19th century to 21st century. In the last part, we will introduce different museum exhibition area. Now I'm going to introduce the overview of the topic. Our project wants to explore the experience and contribution of Chinese women immigrants in Australia. We will discuss the immigration experience of Chinese women in different historical periods, including how Australia immigration law and racial discrimination in different periods affect their immigration life. Throughout the timeline, we divided this historical experience of Chinese women immigrants into 3 main historical periods: the 19th century, 20th century, and the 21st century.
I will be responsible for introduction the exhibition collection and display form of the Melbourne Female Chinese Immigrant Museum. Firstly, the first room on the right will be the main exhibition area of the museum, called History Review. The collection will be arranged in chronological order in the main exhibition area in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. The main exhibition area consists mainly of photos full of historic traces, and each photo is equipped with a detailed text introduction at the bottom left. The photo cover historic events, the living environment of Chinese Australians, the family portrait of Chinese Australian feminists, and the contributions of Chinese women in 3 different periods. Next, Francesca, Aurora, and Amanda will introduce the specific historical background of the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries, and the contribution of Chinese women in Melbourne. Then I'll continue to introduce to you the remaining 6 sections of the pavilion. Welcome to Francesca to introduce the related contents of the 19th century.
This exhibition area will be mainly in the form of text exhibition and integrate some immigrant story and pictures to make the audience better understand the history of this period. We will introduce the overview historical experience and contribution of Chinese in the 19th century. Because the Chinese immigrant in that period are mainly men and the female immigrant groups was relatively small. In the earlier 19th century, Chinese immigrants come to Australia as indentured laborers. After 1840, there is a growing demand of cheap labor. More and more Chinese men come to Australia as indentured laborers. Indentured laborers works mainly as shepherds for private landowners and Australia agricultural companies. Shepherd is a generally unpopular job because of geographical and social isolation, poor living condition, and low salary. After the Chinese arrived in Australia, the difficult working environment is a challenge for Chinese workers. Compared with Xiamen, the place where indentured labor work was very cold. At the same time, Chinese shepherds also face hostility from local Aborigines. Indigenous people also herd sheep and they regard the Chinese as land invaders. The wage of Chinese workers are also very cheap. Chinese shepherds provide less than European shepherds in terms of wage and food supply. Immigration Place Australia records the story of Chinese immigrant family. One of the family members recalled that his great-great-grandfather Yuvana left Xiamen, China at the age of 18 in 1848 on the bark called Numeral and arrived in New South Wales, Australia. Yuvana accepted any job he could find, just trying to make money. Australia's first gold rush began in May 1851. after Edward Hammond Harvard discovered a gold mine in New South Wales. Many Chinese miners were attracted to Australia. The immigrant population of Australia Chinese increased rapidly. In 1854, there were only about 2,000 Chinese in the colony. After the gold rush, by the end of 1859, the number of Chinese had increased to 42,000. The living conditions of the Chinese workers in gold mines are very difficult, and they are racially hostile by many European settlers. Many people do not welcome the arrival of Chinese, which has also aroused strong anti-Chinese sentiment. To ease a large number of Chinese entering Australia, Australia government posed laws restricting the entry of Chinese immigrants in the 19th century. In earlier 1855, Victoria began to require every Chinese on board pay tax. After the implementation of series of restrictions on Chinese, it has a great impact on the Chinese population in Australia. For example, in 1861, about 13,000 Chinese lived in New South Wales, but by 1871, the Chinese living in New South Wales was only half of the population in 1861. In 1881, the New South Wales government passed the Chinese Entering Restriction Act. These immigration restriction laws pose a great challenge to Chinese immigrants. It also leads to the beginning of White Australia policy. The story of family immigrant has been recorded in Immigration Place Australia. James Chong was born in 1855 in a village in Guangdong Province, China. At that time, the living conditions of China were very difficult. Therefore, in 1873, when James was 18, learned that gold had been discovered in Victoria. He immediately took boat to Australia. After arriving at gold mining area in Bendigo area, James found that the living conditions there were very difficult and had to face people's hostility to Chinese people. So he and his friend went to alluvial tin mining boom in northeast Tasmania. Chinese tin miners were one of the earliest pioneers in northeast Tasmania. During the tin mining boom, Jim and his friend leased 100 acres of land at Source Mill, Cameron. They later sold it to Colossal Tin Mining Syndicate of Melbourne and profited from it. Next, Amanda will introduce the 20th century.
Since our exhibition aims to mainly focus on the female group and their immigration experiences, so moving on to the next room of room 1 is about the second critical stage of Chinese immigrants in Australia, with the representative legislation enacted in the 1900s. Before 1901, as Francesca mentioned just now, the Chinese immigrants in Australia were mainly composed of male miner or laborers. As a result, the only option for women to immigrate to Australia was serving as family members to take care of their husband and children. After 1901, the Immigration Restriction Act, which is also known as the White Australia Policy, was developed. This policy aimed to restrict the volume of non-British immigrants, especially Asians. In this case, the Chinese community during that time was put on top of the list to be discriminated against. Females as the most disadvantaged group were treated unfairly under this legislation. Here we will provide some authentic images of the Immigration Restriction Act, alongside a brief summary of the general regulations to give visitors a quick overview of the law and how the immigration experiences of women was restricted. And initially, for the first 2 years of the law, wives are allowed to enter Australia as dependents along with their husbands. However, in 1905, this provision was also repealed. Not only were Chinese wives outside the country not permitted to get in, but female immigrants within Australia also faced deportation. File copies of the application for entry and the refusal to exempt women from the government will also be publicly displayed here. Discriminatory measures under the policy were central to the maintenance of white Australia by excluding Chinese women. During this period, Chinese women were granted a temporary stay for around 6 months in some cases, but this is usually found among the families of well-established businessmen. Few women have the autonomy to immigrate overseas other than as wives or daughters. We have also included here some relevant images of immigrant women's stories. For example, Mrs. Pun Gui, as a woman deeply affected by the White Australia policy, had to return to live in China with her family and children in 1913 because she was restricted from entering Australia and threatened with deportation by the government. Even though her husband was already a very successful local businessman and having been featured in newspapers and supported by other social communities in Australia. However, there are certain complexities within the Chinese women community in Australia. In addition to Chinese women like Mrs. Pun Gui, there are also mixed race Chinese or second generation immigrants. These female immigrants were in a very different position at a time of restrictive immigration laws. Mary Chong, a second generation immigrant born in Australia, was the first woman of Chinese heritage to graduate from an Australian university and worked in a government from 1930 to 1940. Mary's example demonstrates that there is a very small group of Chinese women who were able to successfully complete their education, as well as work in Australia without being openly challenged by the pro-white Australian government and society. Until around 1950, when the policy was gradually relaxed, Australian government started to allow the mass entry of female higher education students from China. So under these conditions, the contribution made by the Chinese female community is often overlooked. However, from an individual perspective, Chinese women made a very significant contribution to family stability and homemaking, even to the demographic growth and balance of Chinese immigrant community in the early years. And from a social perspective, different types of Chinese women contributed to society in disguise when they took on related jobs. So in addition to some pictorial formats of exhibits mentioned above, an equal collection of oral testimonies is included in this showroom as well. We have integrated this audio materials with exhibits. For example, during the immigrant story part, the relevant audio recordings of oral testimonies will be played by pressing a button next to the main character or copied files.
After watching significant changes in 20th century, we then focus on the 21st century exhibition area. Generally speaking, the exhibition area focuses on the two regions with current overall Chinese immigrant status and female immigrants. The current state in the 21st century of Chinese migration is characterized by ethnic diversity and the impact of new policies, bringing cultural diversity. Treasury et al. Investigated the temporal and geographical differences in the residents' choice of Chinese migrant groups at different stages of migration. Until 2011, the residence patterns of Chinese migrant groups continued to reflect group segregation, and migrant groups did not gradually integrate into mainstream society over time, exhibiting ethnic diversity. In the 21st century, Australia's immigration policy went through a period of constant adjustment and change based on the country's economic and social growth needs. The government began to promote skilled migration, which increased its quotas, relaxed international students' permanent residence visas, and established a temporary migration scheme. This has driven rapid growth in migration numbers while pushing skilled migration into the mainstream of Australian immigration, and has led to a great diversity in the regional origin structure, ethno-cultural background, religious beliefs, and language practice of Australian migrants. Transferring to Chinese female immigrants, our museum project focuses on this kind of group. Christina examined how traditional gender roles affect female migrant groups. Between 2001 and 2003, the survey shows that women's career opportunities are compromised by migration, even when they are highly educated and qualified. Many female respondents in Australia indicated that the difficulty of renegotiating work and care in new environments can sometimes lead to the feminization of female obligations, where women take on more traditional gender roles such as wife and mother. This illustrates how female migrants in China face greater difficulties than male migrants, and how different gender identities lead to different migration experiences for men and women. For example, ABC Chinese News reports on significant life choice of Chinese migrant women. One of them is Isabel Zhao, who said she actually enjoys socializing very much. However, in the first few years, she simply did not have the time to do so due to the pressures of work and childcare. Today, she continues to work in cross-cultural marketing, communications, and consulting in Australia. Because of her job and position, Isabel is often the only Asian female face at conferences, and as an executive, she has been asked more than once if she is an intern. Moreover, women also contribute a lot. Chinese female migrants were overlooked in terms of their social contribution in the 20th century, but under the influence of post-colonial feminism, they proved to be involved in family businesses that brought an unexpected economic contribution to Australian society. Ms. Zhang and her friends also took to the streets to give out free hugs to collect donations for Australian wildfires and the Chinese communities affected by the new corona epidemic. In 2020, the museum proudly congratulates the Australian Chinese who have won the Australian Medal and other awards on the Queen's Birthday Honours list. For example, Long Ming has made important contributions into the financial and real estate industry, as well as diversity and inclusion. In Space Part, we will show videos and understanding female pictures. Overall, while the concept of immigration policy in the Australian states has changed over time, the fundamental contradictions remain. For women, the challenges and difficulties they encounter are greater, but have improved with help of feminism and cultural diversity. They also bring more contribution to society. Next, Zhao will introduce the exhibition areas.
In addition to the historic review area, I will introduce the remaining 6 exhibition areas in counterclockwise order. Room 2 is the art creation area, where many excellent artist cartoon works are collected, sarcastically depicting the problematic situation of the Australian Chinese immigrant community in a specific period, such as the anti-immigration cartoon. Then there is Room 3, handicraft display. This exhibition area contains many exquisite costumes left over from the area and daily articles with traces such as opera gong, Chinese drum, gold scaler, and container. Through these historic objectives, visitors can gain insight into the life details of the Australian Chinese community in that period. Next is Room 4, document display area, including books, manuals, newspaper clippings, diaries. Then we go to Room 5, the photo gallery experience area. In this area, we set up 8 transparent rooms, and each room is equipped with a display screen and 3 VR devices. Here, people can borrow the power of haptic as if they are in the real environment of a specific period. After visiting the photo gallery experience area, we will come to Room 6, the multimedia room. Movies, documentaries, and interviews related to the Australian Chinese female immigrant group will be shown every day in turn, such as Floating Life, Manning Road's story of the Chinese on the goldfields of Victoria. Finally, coming out of the multimedia room is Room 7, a souvenir shop. The store contains a variety of souvenirs for visitors to choose from, including netbooks with characteristic Chinese patterns, dolls, Chinese costumes, and imitation handmade products. And the creation of this museum has a following 2 great significance. On the one hand, while telling this history, The Melbourne Female Chinese Immigrant Museum helps local Chinese people to have a deeper understanding and a more comprehensive cognition of their roots, and arouses the deep emotional connections of Chinese descendants. This will help them gain a sense of community identity, and it may also enable them to become a new generation of overseas Chinese who know history, inherit culture, and have a broad vision. On the other hand, the museum exhibits show the unequal experience of female Chinese immigrants in Melbourne and their outstanding contributions to society to the visitors. This means that the facts of social injustice are reviewed and recognized, which further it helps to alert modern society, no matter when and where was born, no matter what language about, deserve equal respect and fair treatment. And that's all. Thanks for your listening.